speak to him. And so we are going to be texting questions to him. And so if you have questions, sometimes questions are only coming to me, and sometimes questions are only coming to Sarah. Sarah, one of the advantages of being of Sarah's generation is that Sarah can text much faster than I can. And so it would be helpful if you were to, when you send your questions, send them to both Sarah and me as opposed to just one of us. Um, there's still a few more people coming in. I feel like you all are.
Astonishingly, my sound just started.
Oh, can you hear Jay?
It just suddenly clicked on. I can hear now.
Great.
Woohoo!
Okay. So there's still a few more people trickling in, and you should still send questions to both Sarah and me, though,
Yes.
even though now we won't have to text them. I was thinking we started out with a larger group of people. Musong, my predecessor, who's here, mentioned that this feels like a graduate seminar, and I feel like the folks who are ready for a graduate seminar, some of you have emailed to say this is the most challenging and interesting study you've ever done in Buddhist studies. This is not necessarily the most exciting thing for everybody, but I am so glad to see that there are this many of you who are so engaged with this course. As many of you know who are used to doing programs with BCBS and other places, we do not contract with our teachers. We are on what's called a Dana basis. And what that means essentially is that we follow a practice that goes back to the time of the Buddha, that we do not have a contract and say, Jay, we're going to give you this much money. Rather, we are offering this course freely. And just as Buddhist teachers today and their teachers and their teachers' teachers and their teachers' teachers, all the way back to the time of the Buddha, were supported by offerings that were made. In the same way, that's how we support ourselves and that's how our teachers are supported. There are several reasons why what we call dana, where English word donation comes from, is so important. Um, it meets the direct needs of people. It's also the first virtue of the bodhisattva. It is a practice of relinquishing and offering. And it is something that I personally find deeply, deeply inspiring, that we're so used to a capitalist economy that everything is transactional and everything is a calculation and a financial exchange, that there's something, a space that is somehow outside of that transactional economy. And especially this year, as we at BCBS have had to shut down our residential programs, and it felt like going out on this risky precipice, what was going to happen. And it's been so deeply grateful that what's happened is that people have come to these online programs and been so generous. And your generosity makes it possible for us to continue to offer these programs and to be here when the pandemic subsides and we can safely reopen. We are not going to reopen too soon, but we will reopen at some point, and we would welcome you back to our intimate retreat center in the trees. So I'm very grateful for all of those who donated when you registered. I know many of you did. And if you are feeling financial hardship, don't worry about it. We will be okay. But if you are able to, we would be very grateful for your financial support to tide us through the pandemic. You'll be receiving an email with a survey and a link to follow. You just press the button and you will be able to make a donation that will go to BCBS and to Jay. So thank you so much, and thank you so much for your attention. I know this course requires an enormous amount of it. And over to you, Jay.
Thank you very much. And before I really get going, I just want to express my deep gratitude to William and to Sarah for organizing all of this and for making it happen and for doing all of the enormous amount of work behind the scenes that makes all of this possible. But also my tremendous gratitude to all of you who have stuck through this. One of the things about dependent origination, and one of the things we'll talk about tonight, is you don't get to be a teacher without students. And I really like being a teacher. So I'm always grateful to people who are willing to be students so that I can do what I enjoy doing. And that gratitude is real. I also know that, as William said, some of the material that I'm taking you through is challenging. It requires a great deal of attention at the end of what's a long day for a lot of people. And I'm very, very much grateful to you for applying that attention, for coming, for thinking hard, and for coming to this once again in a spirit of trying to improve ourselves so that we can be of use to others. That's really why we're doing this. And I just keep reminding you of that. I know it gets boring, but motivation is important. I don't take this to be an abstract exercise in philosophy or even just a nice Monday night amusement, though perhaps it is. What I'm hoping is that it's something that we could, for each of us, can be in some way illuminating and transformative. And so once again, thank you. My plan again for this very final night is similar to my plans for other nights. I do invite you to pose questions as we go. Those questions will get filtered through William and Sarah, and they will pass on to me the ones they deem important for me to stop to address. And it's critical junctures, I'll pause and say, any questions now? But I'm always happy for questions at any point. And I'll try to stop at about 15 or 20, 15 minutes or 10 minutes before our stopping point, before 8:50, so around 8:35 or so, for an open question period at the end. I'm not going to be racing through things. If we don't get to the very end of what I planned, that's okay. I'd rather move carefully and calmly and slowly than race through material and find it losing people. So that's my plan, and we'll hope that it goes well. And now, as the other thing I'm going to say is I'm not going to stop to review what I did in the first 3 sessions. I think we've kind of closed a chapter on the metaphysical part of this. And now we're turning to ethics and turning to the implications of everything that we've talked about. And so it's a nice point of time when we can take a long, deep breath and change gears. And so I'm going to deliberately simply change gears. So now I'm going to, as we say in Zoom world, share my screen. And I'm hoping that what you are seeing is the PowerPoint, which is now going to go into slideshow mode. From here. And is everything working? Okay. So last time we finished with a fun discussion of spontaneity and skillful living, butchering oxen, performing surgery, playing golf, and doing other useful things spontaneously. But the real rubber hits the road, to my mind. I mean, that is some rubber hitting some roads, and that's important. I don't want to downplay it. But the real rubber hits the road when we come to ethics. And so now I really want to turn my attention to the implications of seeing ourselves as persons rather than selves for our ethical life. That's going to be the next topic. And I'm going to be doing that in 3 parts. I first want to talk about moral egoism, which is one of the craziest views in the world and one of the most common, the one that I think has been driving a lot of our society for quite a while, and to explain to you why it seems okay and why it's wrong. And then to give it as an alternative, a kind of selfless landscape that we see when we think of ourselves, not as selves, but as persons, structured by what we call in Buddhist ethics, the Brahma Viharas, or the divine states. And then I'm going to turn to my favorite moral philosopher, Shantideva, and talk a little bit about the idea of selfless agency from his perspective. So there'll be a lot of Buddhist stuff tonight, a lot more perhaps than we've had in other nights. So for those of you who've been worried about the relentless secularity of some of my work, this will bring you back home to what we expect from a Buddhist study center. But then we'll leave it again after that. First, moral egoism. Okay, moral egoism is a view that when you say it out loud, I think sounds insane, but which I do believe that most people in the world think is absolutely correct. And it's simply the view that there is a prima facie reason. By prima facie, I mean you don't have to defend it. It's just a reason that's right there that would have to be overridden by something else to act in my own narrow self-interest. So if you ask somebody, why did you order the pasta instead of the rice? They say, because I like pasta and it's in my interest to order the pasta. And if you ask them, why didn't you give any money to charity this year? You say, it's my money and I can do what I want with it. And I really wanted to save up to see the World Series next year when baseball is back in shape because I like baseball. Or you can just go on and on. We think that just saying that this is what I want or this is mine is perfectly okay. When somebody says, hey, would you be willing to give me a few bucks? And you say, nope, don't want to. That's moral egoism at work. That's the view. And as I said, it sounds really stupid when you say that. I mean, honestly, I think it's really hard to look somebody in the eye and say, do you know what the right way to act is? Just do whatever is in your own narrow self-interest and don't think of anybody else. That's really crazy. Oh, I have to apologize. My poor dog has got a cold and he's coughing a little bit, but he really wants to be with me. So he might sometimes cough a little bit. I'm just going to let him relax. Good boy, Tony. Okay. On the other hand, as I said, this is what most people just generally believe, that a perfectly good reason to give for doing something is, hey, because it's in my interest to do it. And the crazy thing is, this is the foundation of a whole lot of stuff that runs our lives. In particular, microeconomics, the whole idea of game theory, and in general, a theory of rationality. I just want to talk about that for a minute to really give you a sense of how deeply saturated stupidity is in the way that we lead our lives. Because I hope you agree with me that moral egoism is just a moronic view. You can't hold that view with a straight face. But if you're an economist, your definition of a rational actor is somebody who maximizes their own gain. When we do economic planning, very often, we simply assume that each party is going to maximize their own gain. That's how we do tax policy. That's how we do welfare policy. That's how we set up rewards and punishments for things, simply assuming that each person will act in his or her narrow self-interest. And so because that's right at the foundation, and by the way, this is true even of people who are really interested in justice and fairness. So if you read that great classic of contemporary political theory, John Rawls' Theory of Justice, he begins by assuming that for people to be rational agents, each one of them, in thinking about the way they want society structured, should be thinking about what's in their narrow self-interest. John Locke thinks that, Hobbes thought that, Rousseau thought that. It just runs right through our tradition. So stupid maybe, but ubiquitous, yes. And so most people think that if you don't act in your own self-interest, that makes you crazy or irrational. And that to me is kind of the core of the Republican Party right now. The idea that rationality is acting in each person's narrow self-interest, and anybody who wants to act through generosity or caring for others must be a nutcase. So that's moral egoism. And I think that what moral egoism comes from is the self-illusion, that innate illusion of selves. Because in order to be a moral egoist and to look yourself in the mirror and smile and say, I really am a moral egoist, you've got to think that there's a big difference between you and everybody else. Because you've got to think that your interest matters and nobody else's does. And that requires the kind of distance between self and other, between I and those related to me, that is encoded in what we call in Buddhist philosophy the twofold self-grasping of I and mine. There's I, and there's all of the people who've got relations to me, and that primary relation is being other. And the moment you grasp that, then moral egoism starts to make sense, because I'm the center of the moral universe at that point, and everybody else is just some person who happens accidentally to be related to me. So I think the self-illusion, as I said last time, isn't bad just because it's dumb. It isn't bad just because it doesn't make any sense. It's not just bad because it's metaphysically wrong. It's bad because it's an illusion that, unlike the Mueller-Lyer illusion, has terrible consequences for the way that we lead our lives. And one of the worst consequences of the self-illusion is that it seems to make moral egoism make sense when we know that it doesn't make sense. So if you ask the question, all right, think about it this way, the Mueller-Lyer illusion that we've talked about, you say, gee, it's a terrible illusion, but does it really matter? And the answer is no, it's a parlor trick. But if you ask the self-illusion, does it matter? The answer is yes, it makes us bad people. It makes us moral egoists. And that's a really important reason for getting rid of the self-illusion. So I want to contrast it now with what a selfless moral landscape looks like. And doing that, I want to return again to this idea of a moral landscape, or a moral topography, if you want. When I think of myself as a self, then I think of myself, as I like to think about it, as at the center pole of the universe. There's me, and then there's everybody else. There's my family, and I might care about them, and my friends, and I might care a little less about them, but I still care. There's my casual acquaintances. There's my bartender. There's my students. There's my dean. There's my neighbor. And then there's the people who support the same sports team or vote for the same party. But then there's the people who vote for other political parties and who support other sports teams, and they're not so nice. And there's people who look different from me, that's pretty bad. And people who have different customs, that's really horrible, right? And so then my zone of care is circumscribed or defined by how close somebody is to me. So I have to think of myself as at the center of the moral universe. Now, again, we know that's crazy, but I think that's the reflex way of thinking of ourselves when we take ourselves to be selves, as standing there at the center pole. And again, if you think I'm making this up, just think about how we ordinarily think in our daily life. Why am I giving more money to my kids than I do to my neighbors? Well, because they're my kids and they're closer to me. Why do I give Christmas presents to my neighbors' kids, but not to the kids in the next town? Well, because they're my neighbors, right? And so on and so forth. Why do I send nice emails to the people who voted for Democrats and mean ones to the people who voted for Republicans? Because they share my views and they don't share my views, right? So we really do instinctively think of this topology of the moral universe with us at the center, even though we know it's crazy, and that is bound up with that self-illusion. Now, in Buddhist ethics is big and complex and a difficult matter. But one of the most beautiful ideas in Buddhist ethics is the idea of the Brahma Viharas, or the divine states, which really are not the whole of Buddhist ethics, but a part of Buddhist ethics that reflects an alternative viewpoint on the moral landscape and reflects what it's like to see ourselves as moral persons and not as selves. So I want to take you through those. For some of you, this will be familiar, and you can either space out and check your email, or you can hear it one more time. For those of you to whom it's not familiar, this is a nice time to learn something about Buddhist ethics. So the Brahma Viharas, and as I said, I like to translate that as divine states. You sometimes hear divine abidings or divine abodes, and that just sounds too weird to me. That sounds like Buddhist hybrid English. They just mean really great states to be in, really great places to be, if you want. The first one is Maitri. I'll be using the Sanskrit, not the Pali, and I know a lot of people in BCBS are more used to Pali, so if you think in Pali, it's metta. Which really means friendliness. Maitri is the Sanskrit word for a friend. It's often translated as loving kindness. Again, that feels to me a little bit like a lot of Protestantism has crept in here. It really means friendliness, treating everybody as your friend and thinking of them as you think of your friends, wishing well for them, being willing to help them out, hoping things go okay, being willing to share in a project with them and feeling like you're in a shared project. That's friendliness. And friendliness already helps you decenter, because when you start seeing everybody as your friend, then you don't have that kind of distance metric that's going, that the alternative to Maitri suggests. Karuna is the second, sometimes translated as compassion. I think that's one of the worst translations of a term ever in Buddhist studies, but I prefer care, and a lot of other people are coming around to that now. Because karuna is a commitment to act on behalf of others. It's what nurses do and what doctors do. You can say to somebody, if you cared, you would do something. Karuna is an active idea. It's got the same root as karma. You can even see it when you look at it. The word karma means action. So karuna is a commitment to act on behalf of others, to alleviate suffering. And that's also really important, because what it does is it, again, counteracts the idea that some people are more distant from others. It's no accident that one of the world's great charities called itself care. Mudita, this is a term that there's just no good English translation for, so you have to make one up. I think of it as the antithesis of schadenfreude. And I think it's really weird to live in a culture that has a name for schadenfreude, but no name for mudita. Schadenfreude, of course, means taking pleasure in the misfortune of others. And so many of us are working to suppress that right now. But we know what that feels like, right? When you see someone getting their comeuppance and you take pleasure in it, and you also know that there's something wrong with that. But mudita is a wonderful antithesis to that. That's the ability to rejoice and to take pleasure in the success of others. And it's so important because, again, what it does is it reduces distance, and it reduces the idea that there's something very, very special about me and where I am. And then the fourth one, upeksha, upeka, if we're thinking in Pali, often translated as equanimity. That is sort of part of its meaning, but it's not the most important part. The most important part is impartiality, that I feel the same way about everybody, that mudita, that karuna, and that maitri is extended to each person regardless of their relationship to me. And when we look at these, we see that each of these is a construction of a moral universe that is, like I like to think, spherical. There's no center to it. There's no privileged place. Wherever you are, there's a path of reasonable length to you. And it's that ability, that's what comes out from seeing yourself as a person. Because when I see myself as a person, I see myself as playing the role of a friend, the role of a caregiver, the role of a compatriot, the role of a colleague. And all of these take my isolation away and see me in relation to others. Every one of these characterizes a deep interrelation, as Thich Nhat Hanh has called it, interbeing, an existence of mind that is constituted by my relationship to others. And so when we see this, we see what ethics looks like when we're thinking about it that way. Together, when we put the Brahma Viharas, they give us a selfless landscape, a landscape that doesn't have special locations and boundaries. If you've cultivated these, there's no reason to take my own interests as more important than anybody else's. A decentered landscape where there's nothing special about me. Moral egoism thrives on a self and a center. The antithesis to moral egoism is that view that we derive when we cultivate the Brahma Viharas, of occupying this decentered landscape. I think the Brahma Viharas are also rational. That is, I pointed out that moral egoism, one of the things that's wrong with it, besides the fact that it screws our world up, that's enough, right? But the other thing is it's totally irrational. It really requires us to believe that there's something extremely special about me. But, I know that Sarah believes that there's something more special about her, and William that there's something more special about him. So if the three of us get together, we've got a really important fight about who is at the center of the moral universe. Even though they know that it's got to be me, they act as though it's them, right? And then we get conflicts going. I don't know why they do. I think it's self-evident that it's me, but they think the same thing. Um, the Brahma-viharas, on the other hand, reflect a rational way of seeing things. That is, there really isn't any moral difference between me and anybody else. That's the reasonable way to think about things. There's nothing special about me versus William versus anybody. And so another great thing about the Brahma Viharas is not only do they make our lives better, but they're a more reasonable way to see ethics. So I want to first say that one of the great,
Jay,
yes,
Jay, there was a question about the Brahma Viharas
yeah,
that I think you may want to address, and that is, what about when people are held accountable or justice and feeling good about justice being done, or that
yeah.
wrongs are not just let go? Is there a difference between that and Schadenfreude?
I think there can be, but there often isn't. And I think this is a problem in the way that we've been raised to think about justice and agency. And we'll come to some of that when we talk about Shantideva, believe it or not. But I want to pause and answer that question more directly. A lot of us and a lot of our legal system thinks about justice as retribution, as giving somebody what they deserve so that victims can have satisfaction. And we hear that language all the time. In these horrible days when Bill Barr and Donald Trump have been racing to execute as many people as they possibly can before they leave power, the language that Bill Barr used was, we need to give the victims satisfaction, as though you can just smack your lips and say, yeah, the sucker died, I feel a lot better. I just find that horrific. That's just me maybe, but I just find that horrific. It's one thing to think that we need a legal system that does what is necessary in order to protect us from people who are genuinely harmful to themselves and others. And I think we do expect our state to protect us from genuinely harmful people. It's another thing to think that what the goal of justice should be is retribution rather than restoration or rehabilitation. So I think that to the degree that we cultivate a sense of interrelation, as Thich Nhat Hanh says beautifully in his discussion of interbeing, we have to see our kinship not only with victims, but with perpetrators, and to understand how in the right circumstances, we could have been perpetrators as well, and to think about what would be necessary to correct our behavior or to protect people from us, rather than to think about what would be necessary for vengeance to occur. I think that's a difficult moral place to get to. I don't think ethics is easy. I don't think ethical cultivation is easy, and I don't want to pretend that it is. And what I'm not saying is, hey, see those 4 things? Just tick them off, resolve to do each one, and you're done with your moral practice. Each of these, they're called divine because you've basically got to be a divinity to really achieve them. But each of them can be seen as a goal that makes us more effective and morally sound, not only when we deal with other moral agents who we respect and like, but also when we deal with those we don't like and of whom we don't approve. And I think that's really important too. A lot of that has to do with how we think of people as moral agents. Do we think of them as interdependent beings subject to causes and conditions? Or do we think of them as autonomous selves acting freely? The more we have that self-illusion, the more we tend to think that people are doing something just because they're bad and we need retribution. The more we take the person sense, we think of everybody, including perpetrators, as interdependent beings whose behavior is caused by a multitude of causes and conditions. And we think first about what we need to do to transform those causes and conditions in order to transform that behavior. That's the difference between seeing ourselves and others as selves versus as independent persons. I think that's really, really important. I would also say as a footnote, alas, we don't have time to do this. But when you think about the Brahma Viharas, it's also really important to talk about what the great ethicist Buddhaghosa calls both the far enemies and the near enemies of each one. I'm almost tempted to do that now, but it's not about selves. So here's what you do. When my book on Buddhist ethics comes out this spring, take a look. Or just read Buddhaghosa, that's even better, in the Path of Purification, in the Brahma-vihara chapter. He's so good about talking about how you can convince yourself that you're cultivating a Brahma-vihara and actually be cultivating a vice. You can think you're being a good friend when in fact you're becoming partial and clannish. You can think that you're developing karuna when what you're really developing is sloppy sympathy. You can think that you're developing mudita when all you're doing is cheering for your own team. And you can think that you're developing upeksha when all you're doing is stopping caring about people. There, I've talked about the near enemies, even though I said I wouldn't. But all of that's to say it's really, really hard to attain that kind of moral stance. But just as it's hard to shed the self-illusion, the point that I really want to make is that the self-illusion and moral egoism go together. The person view and the Brahma-viharas go together. Irrationality and indefensibility is on one side, and a defensible moral attitude and rationality is on the other. You choose.
Jay, do you want any more questions about the Brahma Viharas, or are you wanting to go on?
You see any others that I should handle before I go on to Shantideva?
Oh, there was a question about equanimity as a more common translation instead of impartiality,
Yeah,
and a
it's
question about practicing these. Isn't that actually a kind of good? Isn't that also in my self-interest? I imagine you would discuss that to some degree with Shantideva as well,
yeah.
perhaps. But
Let me answer both of those really quickly and then go to Shantideva, but they'll be quick, easy answers. The first is equanimity and impartiality are each okay. But the equanimity, that is the lack of feeling too happy about things happening to people close to you or too disappointed, is really coming out of impartiality. And upeksha is a complicated word that is straddling these two. But I think the impartiality is the more important part, because the equanimity, the calm that comes out, is a calm that comes from seeing myself not as especially connected to particular people, but as connected to everybody. It's not, equanimity is not a terrible translation, but I think it misses that really important idea that I'm treating everybody, friends, enemies, people I don't know, in the same way. And that second question, I lost it, was,
well, isn't this kind of a practice in my self-interest anyway?
oh, of course it is. And it is because you're no different from anybody else. So if it's in your self-interest to be rational. It's in your self-interest to transcend delusion. It's in your self-interest to be a good person, but it's also in everybody else's interest. It's not just in your self-interest. It's in the interest of everybody you're ever going to meet and everybody on whose lives you're going to have any effect. And you are no different from any of them. So when we talk about these virtues, Maitri applies to yourself too. You've got to be a good friend to yourself. There's a nice Sarah McLachlan lyric about that. Karuna, care, has to do with yourself. You've got to take care of yourself as well. You've got to be happy about your own accomplishments as well as other people. It's not like you have to denigrate yourself in favor of everybody else, just to recognize that just as you count, so do other people. Just as other people count, so do you. That's upeksha. But now I'm going to go to Shantideva.
Good. Before we go into Shantideva, there was one question about your background and
Oh,
what it was, and I thought maybe this would be a good time before we start Shantideva to say something.
oh, what a perfect time. Yes. My background is the ruins of Nalanda University, which for over 500 years was the largest university in the world, about 10,000 students, occupying a campus of almost 10 square kilometers in India. And many of the very great Buddhist philosophers who we are accustomed to reading, people like Bhaviveka and Chandrakirti, people like Shantideva, people Dharmakirti and Dignaga, taught at Nalanda University. It's also worth remembering that Nalanda University was an ecumenical university. Not only were all of the different schools of Buddhist philosophy represented there, but lots of non-Buddhist philosophy was represented there. And it was also a center for the arts. carving, sculpture, painting, all kinds of things like that. Grammar, medicine, science. It was a comprehensive and wonderful university. The ruins are very moving. For me, I have to say, this is just personal. Of all the places I go in India, and I spend a lot of time there, the place that reliably brings tears to my eyes is Nalanda, just because of how much great philosophy happened there and how much Buddhism developed there and what a great academic spirit it had. And since we'll be talking about Shantideva next, and Shantideva taught at Nalanda, it's very appropriate to remark on that background. So I often like to teach with Nalanda in that virtual background to remind me of that gorgeous place. Because here's something important. Now I'm going to digress. I think one of the ways to begin to cultivate some of these qualities, especially things like mudita and maitri, is to recognize how much we owe others. Gratitude is a hell of a wonderful virtue. It reminds us that we are not autonomous, that we never have stood on our own 2 feet and never will, that we owe enormous amounts to our friends, to our parents, but also to our teachers. And whenever I'm teaching, this is just who I am, it might not be who you are, I'm thinking about my teachers and who taught me and how much what I'm saying now simply reflects something that somebody else taught me. And if what I'm thinking about my Buddhist teachers, who I think about a great deal when I'm teaching this, each of them traces their lineage back to Nalanda, especially if my teachers are Tibetan. They trace their lineage back to Shantarakshita and Kamalashila, and Shantarakshita and Atisha. And Shantarakshita, Kamalashila, and Atisha all came from Nalanda University to Tibet. So that Nalanda lineage is something that you share, that we share. And thinking about Nalanda reminds me just how interdependent we are and just how much a little gratitude can undermine that evil pride that can turn up when I think, this is a really cool idea, and forget that I got this really cool idea from William, or I got this really cool idea from Geshe Yeshe Tapka, or I got it from reading Shantideva or somebody like that. So Nalanda is partly there to remind me of where we all come from, to the degree that we work in the Indian and Tibetan philosophical tradition as I do. So now let's talk about Shantideva, who taught in Nalanda in the 8th century and was a wonderful philosopher. The text that we're going to be talking about, he really has 2 books. One is Bodhicharya Avatara, often translated as something like Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life or Engaging in the Bodhisattva Deeds. I translate it differently. I translate it as How to Lead an Awakened Life. And then there's another book called Shiksha Samachaya, which is an anthology for students. And it's kind of the course pack that goes along with Bodhicharya Avatar. It's all of the citations and relevant, it's a compendium of quotations from other texts that are relevant to the points that are made in Bodhicharya Avatar. But we're going to be talking about Bodhicharya Avatar. And we're going to be talking about primarily the 6th chapter, which is everybody's favorite chapter, the chapter on patience, which is one of the great Bodhisattva virtues. So what I'm going to talk about first is the idea of freedom and the whole myth of agent causation that are tied up with the self-illusion and what we want to do to think of ourselves not as free and as agents, but in different ways. So we're going to talk about why we should believe it and why it's crazy. So I'm going to talk first about why we believe it. We often believe that we are free agents of our actions. So I say to myself, right now, I am going to raise my right arm all by myself and nobody's going to stop me. There it is. I did it freely and there were no causes for it. I just had a desire and boom, I did it. Those of us who grow up in broadly European cultures inherit this idea of freedom from St. Augustine. We often forget that. And St. Augustine had to invent it because he was worried about a problem, a very specific problem, and that was the fall from the Garden of Eden. Because the problem was that when Eve ate that apple and handed it to Adam, God was in the background. And if God was omnipotent, that is, he could do whatever he wanted, and was omniscient, he knew everything, and omnibenevolent, that is, he only wanted good for people, why the hell did he let Eve do that? He could have stopped her. He could have killed the snake. He could have moved the tree. He could have done all kinds of things, right? But he didn't do it. And so it sounds like it's God's fault that we fell from Eden. And that makes God into a bit of an asshole and not worthy of praise and all of that stuff and worship. And Augustine thought that was an intolerable conclusion, right? And so in order to avoid that, he invented a new faculty called voluntas, or will, and said that human beings have a general faculty of action. Oh, and by the way, it's exempt from causality. So that is that we're completely free. We act without any causes. And that's why God couldn't have stopped Eve, because she was acting freely and not causally. And so it wasn't God's fault, so we can still worship. Now, you might be really worried about the fall and how to solve this problem of theodicy. And if you are, you should take freedom of the will very seriously. But if you're not, I ask you, do you honestly believe that you as a biological organism in the world are free from the causal nexus and just act on it? You might feel that way, but you know it's crazy, because you know you're just a physical biological organism in a natural world. More than that, freedom in this sense, what I call Augustinian freedom, the kind that we really think that we have, is really a stupid idea, because you don't want your acts to be uncaused. Like, even when I raised my hand, I wanted that to be caused by my desire and my intention. If it wasn't caused by my intention, I wouldn't be free. I'd be demonically possessed, right? Or something like that. We don't want it to be random. I don't want my arms just to be like random stuff whenever when I want them to go up. I want them to be caused by my intentions. And I want my intentions to be caused by my general goals. My goal was to have an easy philosophical example that would work on Zoom. And I want that goal to have been the cause. And I want my goals to have been caused by my general values and my desires and so on and on. I don't want to be random. I don't want to be, just arbitrary. So in order to be free in the way you'd like to be free, you have to think that you're not absolutely free in the Augustinian sense. You have to think that you are subject to causal laws, and that's something that we want to be. So the whole idea of agent causation makes us feel like independent selves, right? That's the self-illusion coming back again. When you think of yourself as an absolutely free agent, you think of yourself as an independent self. When you think of yourself rationally, you think of yourself as an interdependent being. So what real agency, when we really act, looks like, is dependence on causes and conditions, including our psychological causes, but also including lots of things coming from outside of us. What I'm talking to you about right now was caused by what my teachers have taught me, was caused by the books that I've read, was caused by things that happened in Nalanda over 1,000 years ago. And that requires me to be an interdependent being in a world, not an autonomous self, but a person. And this, as Shantideva is going to point out, has big implications for moral emotions. And again, this is more rubber hitting other roads. When we think about moral emotions, they're a huge part of our moral life. Things like resentment or anger or pride or gratitude, those are all moral emotions. Some of those moral emotions might feel really healthy, but on reflection, they're not. So a lot of people think anger is a really good thing. A lot of people do, not only just ordinary people, but philosophers who think about this will say things like, if you don't get angry at injustice, that shows that you don't really care about it. Or if you don't get angry when somebody else is harmed, it shows that you don't treat them with respect. Or if you don't resent somebody else taking your parking place, it shows that you think of yourself as a doormat and you don't have any self-respect, or things like that, right? Now, Shantideva argues that a lot of what we might think of as reasonable or healthy moral emotions are really irrational and that are grounded in the idea of autonomy and self. Whereas when we think of ourselves as interdependent persons, we can cool down those emotions. And one of the ones that he cares about most is anger, which he thinks of as the opposite of patience, anger with ourselves or anger with others, and thinks that we can calm anger by thinking of ourselves as interdependent persons rather than as independent agents. So now we're going to talk about Shantideva, and you can see we're in chapter 6, this beautiful patience chapter. And I'm just going to read with you and comment on these verses. These are some of my favorite passages in the book. The problem is I say that about almost every passage, so just take that part with a grain of salt, but I do love these. Shantideva writes, when I don't get angry with sources of great suffering, such as jaundice, like if you get sick, you don't get angry at the germs or the illness or your liver, right? Why get angry with sentient beings? They're also propelled by conditions. The reason we don't get angry with the germs that make us sick is we think, well, they're not acting freely. They're just, microbes that are caused to do what they do. But, when somebody does something really bad and nasty to me, if I think of them as an autonomous self acting freely, that might be a reason for anger. But the longer I think about it, I have to think they're just an organism propelled by causes and conditions, including things in their environment, maybe things in their genetic makeup, maybe stuff that their parents did to them, all kinds of causes and conditions, just like germs, right? And then he says, look, consider this. Although nobody wants them, illnesses like jaundice befall us. That is, you don't choose to get sick, right? You don't say, aha, tomorrow afternoon, I'm going to catch a really bad cold. This stuff happens to us. We feel passive with respect to it. And so he says, look, although nobody wants them, our psychopathologies befall us. People don't say, I'd like to become an asshole. Now I'm going to do it. I'd like to become greedy right now. I'm going to become a greedy person. Now I'm going to work to make myself really cruel, right? Those are things that happen to us as a result of lots of causes and conditions. So if our reaction to people is to blame them for that, and to become angry at them for that, Shantideva thinks, that's a maladaptive response that fails to be rational, and at this point treats them as a self rather than as a person, treats them as an autonomous ego rather than as something subject to all of the interdependence to which we're all subject. He says, nobody ever thinks, let me now come into existence. Nobody thinks, now let me be angry, right? Instead, you just get angry, right? That's how it happens. And so Shantideva concludes this little passage, all of our errors, everything we screw up on, and we all have them, and all of the various kinds of evil that we do, and each of us does it, arise from the forces of causes and conditions. None of them are autonomous. Everything that anybody does, they are caused to do. When we recognize that, that should change our moral attitude, replacing anger with patience. So he says, thus everything depends on something else, right? And that on which it depends isn't independent. If you know this, you should never be angry at things that are just like magical illusions, things that are just produced. So when one sees anyone, friend or enemy, perform an unreasonable action, you can think, this has been brought about by causes and conditions, right? That's what's going on. And when people when you asked that question earlier about justice and about punishment, I think that's really important. When we think about why somebody commits a crime, yes, it's important that there be consequences for crimes. And yes, it's important that we protect ourselves from criminals. But those consequences shouldn't be consequences that are grounded in the idea that a person chose their life and acted freely, but rather on the necessity to end behavior of that kind. And then he has that wonderful line. He says, if I'm injured by something like a stick, right? Bang, bang, bang. And I get angry with the person who wields it, then since he, like that stick, is impelled by aversion, it would make sense for me to be angry at that aversion, right? That anger is something that presupposes a view about human nature that makes no sense. His knife and my body are the two causes of suffering. Since he holds the knife and I hold my body, which one should I be angry? I just wanted to leave you with that little bit of Shantideva before we move to the next topic, because what Shantideva is doing.
Jay,
Yeah.
a few people have been asking which translation you're using. I imagine it's yours from the Tibetan, but I just wanted
That's
to double
correct.
check.
This is my translation from the Tibetan. If you want to read the text, there are 3 very, very good translations available right now. They each have slightly different virtues from each other, but they're all very good. One is by Crosby and Skilton, published by Oxford University Press, which is very nice for those who like a lot of scholarly apparatus. Then there's one by Wallace and Wallace, which is actually my sort of favorite because it compares the Tibetan and the Sanskrit editions very nicely. And then there's a very beautiful one by the Padmakara Translation Group, which I also like because it captures more of Shantideva's poetic voice than the other ones do. Each of those three is very, very good and very reliable, and the differences between them are very small. But this is just my way of translating it, which is a little bit different from each of those other three.
There's a request to go back to the previous slide very briefly.
You bet. There it is. Are there issues particularly that people want me to talk about any particular verse or translation choices?
No,
Okay.
not that anybody has asked.
So if you're interested for the weird ones, psychopathology is translating klesha. Things like that. Okay, this is just me.
They are asking if your translation is available.
No, because I haven't translated the whole text. I only kind of translate verses as I go along for giving talks. And I'm not going to translate it because Luis Gomez did a beautiful translation that Paul Harrison is editing. And I know that that will be absolutely perfect and will never be surpassed. So at one point I thought about translating it, but then when I heard that the late Luis Gomez had completed his and that Paul was editing that, I thought there's no reason for anybody else ever to touch that text in English. But who knows when that will be out. But I'm always happy to share the little bits and pieces I've translated. I'm not very good at this, but it's just the way I like to do it. So the big point I wanted to make about Shantideva was just this, that Shantideva, following on the idea of the Brahma Viharas, is thinking very much of ethical cultivation as cultivating an attitude that reflects our interdependence, not our independence. Being a self is all about being independent. And the more you think of yourself as independent, the more you think that anger is justified, the more you think that egoism is justified, the more you think that interdependence is the way you are, the more you think that patience is justified, and that an attitude like the Brahma Viharas is more justified. And you begin to stop thinking of yourself in terms of free agent causation and more as part of a broad interdependent community. So now we've kind of finished what I intended to finish by the end of last class. And I want to talk a little bit about being a person among persons, which is what I intended to do tonight. We won't do all of it, but we'll talk about some of the more fun parts. Okay, so really wanted to talk about three things, and I'm going to talk about each one only a little bit. One was what I call affirmation. That is what it is to become a person and how we become persons. Second, what it's like to be an embedded, embodied person in the world. And third, how to get over yourself. I'm going to skip around a little bit because I'm conscious of the time, but I wanted to remind you about fact and fiction. And because when I talk about us as persons, I am talking about us as fictional entities. And so I wanted you to remember that that doesn't mean that we're not real, because fact and fiction are the same word. They each mean artifice. They mean something created. And I think that's really important, so that when we create fictions, we constitute facts. When we write a novel, we make facts about the characters that often transcend the novel. But when we create social fictions, universities, Buddhist study centers, and so forth, we also create facts on the ground. And when we create ourselves as fictional beings, as persons, we create facts about us. So there are literary facts. So, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, created by Shakespeare, but inhabiting Tom Stoppard's play a few centuries later. For any of you who have read Ahab's Wife, you'll know that Herman Melville's characters reappear in a wonderful novel. It was about 20 years ago, which is still one of my favorite recent feminist novels. But then, as I said, if you don't like literary fictions, think about economic facts, which are things we made up. Money is something whose value is always fictional, but that doesn't mean that there aren't economic facts. And as I suggested, I think money is the best analogy for us. The fact that our identities are conventional and in a sense fictional doesn't mean that they're not real. And the big payoff from that is that when we think of persons versus selves, we think of conventionally real instead of ultimately real things. But conventional reality, even though it's fictional reality, is the only kind of reality we could possibly have. It feels like it might be second-rate reality, but in fact, Non-fictional or ultimate reality doesn't even make any sense. To say that something is real is to say that it's made. To say that we're real is to say that we're brought into existence by the cultures and the biology that we inhabit. Um, so I'm going to skip this slide because I'm aware of time, but I want to talk about development for a minute. This also gets back to gratitude, but it also gets to relationality. I want to talk about the importance of second persons. Very often in contemporary philosophy, especially if you're reading the literature that I read a lot and I know William reads a lot, you see a lot of people talking about the difference between first person perspectives and third person perspectives, and say valorizing contemplative practices because they give me a first person perspective on my experience as opposed to a third person perspective by just hearing about it from somebody else or looking at scientific data. That's okay. What people forget about are second persons. And I think second persons are the most important because when you were a little baby, you became who you are by interacting with a second person. You recognized your mother or your other caregivers as persons before you recognized yourself. You recognized intention in them. You recognized kindness in them. You recognized warmth and comfort and humor in them before you knew that you were anybody at all. And you came to know who you were by coming to know who they were and by seeing that they recognized you and cared about you. So we become who we are in virtue of our interaction with second persons. And so much of our moral life, as well as our cognitive life, is spent as we are spending it now, with me thinking of you and you thinking of me as a you, not thinking about they, not thinking about the third person, but thinking about each other. And when we think about each other, we can't help but to think of ourselves as beings in relation. And it's that being in relation that constitutes our personhood. And so I want you to stop, to the extent that you can, thinking of first and third person as the important dichotomy, and to recognize that each of those is grounded in the second person. Second persons are important to us psychologically because they make us who we are when we are young children. They're important to us epistemologically, that is in our understanding of ourselves, because we come to know what it is to be a person, how to behave, how to listen, how to talk, how to address through our dyadic interactions with other second persons. And they're important to us ontologically, that is, they make us who we are, because who you are is always constituted by those with whom you are in interaction. You cannot escape that. If you're a teacher because you can say you to students. If you are a friend, you're a friend because you can say you to a friend. If you're a mother, you can say that you are a mother because you can say you to a child, and so forth. And so these second persons make us who we are. It's part of our interdependence. And it again reminds us that when we're persons and not selves, what's important isn't our individual identity, it's our relatedness. That is an essential part of our interbeing. So when we think about being in the world, I want to talk only about a few pieces of this because I do want to leave time for questions. But I want to start with this idea of bees and hives, which I think is a really neat idea. And it comes to me from Bernard Mandeville, who was an unfortunately neglected 18th century Scottish philosopher, who wrote a great book called The Fable of the Bees, which nobody reads anymore, and it really annoys me because it's a good piece of Scottish philosophy. But what Mandeville pointed out was that, I'm just going to make this point really straightforwardly, you don't figure out how a beehive works by first figuring out how a bee works and then multiplying by 10,000. You figure out how a bee works by figuring out how a beehive works and then figuring out what you've got to be to function in that environment. And Mandeville's point was that's what it is to be a person. You don't understand how your society works by figuring out how a human being works and then multiplying by 300 million. You figure out how Americans, how it is, what it's like to be an American by figuring out how American society works, and then figuring out what it is to be a part of that. That's really important, because what that means is that who we are is determined by our relations to everyone else. That's the antidote to thinking of standing on your own 2 feet as a self. You're not an independent self, and then you pour a whole bunch of independent selves onto North America and you get the United States. Instead, you start out with an interdependent world, and that interdependent world makes us the beings that we are, just as hives make bees the things that they are. The same thing's true about theaters. You don't sort of first invent Hamlet, then invent Julius Caesar, then invent Willy Loman, then invent a whole bunch of other characters and say, what are we going to do with all these characters we've invented? Oh, let's write plays to put them in. And then we'll build buildings to put those plays in. You start out with the theater as an institution, and the theater enables you to write plays, and plays enable you to create characters. And Willy Loman only exists as a character because of the institution of the theater. Again, in the same way that we exist as who we are, because of the context in which we figure. That's why I started with that metaphor of thinking of ourselves as characters, as roles or characters, not as actors. Human life, I just want to say, is exactly the same thing. We are complicated bees constituted by the hives that we enter, more like theatrical roles than autonomous individuals. And the important piece of that, I'll skate over this very quickly, is normativity. Our ability to function according to rules that we internalize. Some of those are rules of languages. Some of those are rules of legal rules, moral rules. But a lot of those are the norms of address that allow us to speak to one another. We saw a few moments ago that second personhood is absolutely essential to who we are. But second personhood requires that we can address one another, that I can talk to you right now as I am now, that you can talk to me, that you can talk to your friends. And address requires that you speak a language. And the language requires that you recognize rules for the use of terms. And rules require that you've got an entire set of institutions that constitute those rules. So if who you are as a first person depends on who you are as a second person, who you are as a second person depends upon a lot of third persons to make that second person relationship possible. Not going to talk about that because we don't have time, but I do want to talk about this. I've talked a little bit about being a little child. I want to talk now about being an adult. Second persons might be important to us in being children, but when we think about ourselves as adults, when we talk to each other as we are now, when we address, when we understand each other, we're engaged in interpretation. Hermeneutics just means the practice of interpretation. So when I think right now that people are kind of listening to what I'm doing, I'm interpreting their behavior. But our own subjectivity is hermeneutical as well. When I say right now, I believe that our subjectivity is hermeneutical, I'm not reading a sentence written in my head that says our subjectivity is hermeneutical. I'm interpreting my own behavior. I'm interpreting my own thinking process in terms of language. And I can't do that without language. And that means I can't know who I am without being a member of a linguistic community. And that means even my own first person access is totally bound up with third person access and totally bound up with second person access. So again, when somebody tells you, oh, the really important thing about contemplative practice is that it gives you a first person perspective on your inner life, I want to say no. It's giving you a first person perspective modulated by a second person perspective with your meditation teacher, modulated by a third person perspective with the languages that you speak and the background that you have. And all of those are interdependent. You don't shed the third person when you look inside. You don't shed the second person when you look inside. Those are always present. Part of being a person is being in a matrix of other persons. That is, where you become persons through meaning. And meaning isn't something that any of us can constitute individually. It requires a community and a collective. It requires a hive for us bees. The way that I put that is that the we is prior to the I. We are and that's true with a baby and mom for sure, but it's true for all of us. We collectively write the play, do the improv theater that gives us the roles that make us the persons that we are. We can't become I without participating in these institutions like theater that make us possible. Just as you don't first invent Ophelia, then you invent Clytemnestra, then you invent Willy Loman, and then say, now what can we do with all of these characters? We don't invent ourselves and then construct our collectives. We begin with collectives that make us who we are. That's what it is to be a person and not to be a self. I was going to talk about other minds, but I'm not going to now, but I am going to talk about this. Why should we care about all of this? This is the last thing I want to say. Why is what I've been talking about for the last 4 weeks important? If we were selves, if we were autonomous individual beings, other people simply wouldn't matter, except as parts of our environment, tools that we could use. We know people who treat other people like that, but we don't treat other people like that. Other people aren't tools. They're part of who we are. And other people matter because we're not selves. They matter because we're persons. If other people didn't matter, we wouldn't matter either. That is, here's the deep incoherence. If you don't care about others, then there's no reason for you to care about yourself, because you don't make a damn bit of difference. You're just one organism in a vast world, unrelated to anything else. Who the hell cares about you? What makes you important is that you are important to others. And what makes others important is that you care about them and they care about others. It's the interrelations that make sense. So what gives our life meaning? What's the meaning of our lives? Well, it's not our existence as biological organisms. That's just totally uninteresting. What makes us important is that we're persons. Just as what makes Benedict Cumberbatch interesting isn't that he's some British guy, so he plays all these great roles on stage. What makes us important is our reality as persons, and that requires other persons to play against, second persons, others, collectives that make our meaning possible. And that requires the community of other persons. The only way we can even think of ourselves as worthy of any consideration, the only way we can think of our lives as meaningful at all, is to think of ourselves as members of a community of meaningful beings. And that means that what makes your life valuable is the value of the life of everybody around you. What makes their life valuable is the value of the lives around them. And it's only interbeing that makes being make any difference at all. So, how do you get over yourself? The first thing to see is there is no snake in the wall. There is no self. You've got to figure out what that self is and reason your way out of it. That illusion isn't simply irrational, as we've seen. It's morally problematic, and it makes your life appear worthless, meaningless, of no account at all. And the irony is that people think, well, if I weren't a self, if there weren't some deep core to me, my life would be meaningless. And what I think we learned from this investigation is, if you were a self, if there was that independent core, your life would be meaningless, because meaning only comes from interrelation. The self-illusion is the illusion to eliminate. It only gets in the way. It doesn't make us more than we really are. It doesn't make us better. The illusion stops us from becoming who we could be. It blocks us from friendship, from maitri. It blocks us from caring about others, from karuna. It blocks us from rejoicing in the happiness of others, which is where all of your happiness comes from anyway. I mean, how much happiness can you give yourself? It's really only other people who can make you happy. So it blocks mudita. And it blocks our ability to treat others with the kind of respect that is reflected in upeksha. So the self just gets in the way, not only of self-understanding, but of any real happiness and any real meaning in our lives. And being a person is pretty cool. right? That's the other thing I want to say. It's not like the bad news is you're not a self. Oh my God, we're not what we wanted to be. You're better than a self. Being a person is so much better. It makes morality possible. It makes meaning possible. It makes sense of your life. So, hey, getting over yourself is a good thing because it turns you into a person. And it doesn't undermine your reality at all, because the only kind of reality there is the conventional reality that persons have, not the ultimate reality that you thought that a self could have. And the bottom line for me is, if what you care about is your life mattering, remember that you only matter if others do. If others don't matter to you, then you don't matter to yourself. And if your goal is to lead a life where your own existence matters, then pay attention to others. That's what it is to be a person and not a self. And I close with one word from my dear late friend, Sandy Huntington, to whom I dedicate this book. Sandy said once to me, the finer the hair, the more important it is to split it. And if you think that in distinguishing a self from a person, we're just splitting a hair, I want to agree with you. And if you think it's such a fine hair that there's almost no difference, I'll agree with you. But I also agree with Sandy that if that hair is fine, it's more important to split it. And my hope is that over the last 4 weeks, we have split that hair in a productive way. And with that, I will stop and take questions. And we do have a few minutes for questions.
Great. Thanks, Jay. There are a bunch of comments that have come in appreciating how everything has built up to this lecture and how it's all fitting together. So I just want
I'm happy about that.
to articulate that. There are also some questions that are related to kind of traditional Buddhist doctrine.
Sure.
So, like, what's the place of karma? How does karma associate with a person? And also what's the how do you make, where does intention come from, and
Okay.
These sorts of questions.
Should I start there with karma and intention?
Sure.
I'll start there, because after all, we are a Buddhist study center, and at some point we should talk a little bit about these Buddhist ideas. Karma is central to everything I've been talking about, absolutely everything. And that may not have been obvious, but I'm going to make it obvious to you now, I hope, or at least I'll make it vaguely plausible. The word karma in Sanskrit, as most of you know, means action. And then derivatively through the word karma pala, which means the effect of action, it then gets contracted again to mean action and its effects. So when we talk about karma, we're talking about actions and the effects of actions. Now, to me, what that means when I say that my life is determined by karma, it means that the actions that I perform now, the thoughts that I have now, whatever tiny bits of insight I might have, whatever illusion I might have, is all caused by previous actions, causes, and conditions. Some mine, some those of other people. And whatever I do now, whatever I say now, will have effects. Some of them I hope positive, some of them I fear negative. That is karma in action. So I think that when we talk about karma, that is just a way of talking about interdependence. Everything comes back to interdependence, to praticca samutpada, dependent co-origination. Karma is a way of encoding that. So my thinking is that if I think of myself as a person, then I think of myself as a member of a network of causes and effects, so subject to karma and producing karma. If I think of myself as a self, I think of myself as independent of everything else, and so not subject to karma. So if I take karma seriously, I have to reject the self-illusion. If I grab that self-illusion, that's a way of denying the importance of karma in my life. So I think that's just totally important. Karma just encodes the idea that we are the effects of what happened before us, and we are the causes of what come after us. Now, the second was intention, right? So in Sanskrit, intention is chaitana. Buddhaghosa beautifully refers to chaitana as the forerunner of all things, the thing that makes action go. I think it's a lovely way of putting that. Intention is extraordinarily important, obviously. But it's important to see that intention isn't autonomous. It couldn't be. Intention comes about through causes and conditions, just like anything else. So now I intend to explain intention. And if I intend to explain intention, that's because somebody put a question in chat that William read, and then William said, hey, will you talk about intention? And I said, okay. So that was kind of the causal chain that led to it. If intentions just popped into our minds without previous causes and conditions, that would be like thought insertion for schizophrenics, right? We wouldn't have any control over what we were doing. My gosh, an intention just occurred, I better act on it. That would be horrifying. If it did, of course, it would be because of an external cause. But we certainly don't want random intentions. We want our intentions to be caused by what's happening around us, by our perceptions, by our attitudes, by our emotions, by our values, by what we care about. So to say that action is free in a reasonable sense is to say that it's caused by our intentions. But to say that our intentions are our intentions is to say that our intentions are caused by previous causes and conditions with which we identify. And I think that's really important to see. That talking about the importance of intention is important for the kind of freedom we want, but it's not freedom from causality, it's freedom within causality. And that means it's freedom within karma. That's why karma and chaitanya are completely consistent. I hope that makes sense. And you don't have to do Buddhist analysis to see this. David Hume offers exactly the same analysis in the Treatise of Human Nature. It's a very beautiful analysis, as does Arthur Schopenhauer in his beautiful essay on the freedom of the will, which is a great essay that makes all of these same points. So you don't have to go to Buddhism to do this, but it's a good place. You can also go to European philosophy and find some of the same ideas. What else?
So, Jay, there's a family of questions that have to do with is there a difference between reasoning oneself to the view of the person and not the self versus practices? And that goes together with some other questions that came up about, say, well, shouldn't I be giving my child gifts more than the person in the other town? Like, what is the practice of this, and where does it become something that we might want to reject?
I think the answer to this is complex. And I want to talk a little bit about that complexity without trying to intrude into anybody's family life at the holiday season, which could be a little bit dangerous. So let me kind of start there. Part of who we are beings in second person relations, as I've been emphasizing, as well as third person relations. And seeing the moral landscape as decentered, I think it depends on and does not undermine those second person relations. So we do owe particular things to our children and to our intimates because of those second person relations. Just like I owe particular things to my students and not to other people's students. I've got to deal with them that I'll read their work and comment on it and give them classes. Whereas if William calls me up and says, you haven't done anything for my students in years, I'm going to say, well, yeah, that's your job, not mine, man. And that seems fair enough because, there's a reasonable division of labor. And a lot of what we owe our children is a sense of being loved and cared for in dyadic relations. So there are things that we do for them to bring them into adulthood. But I think that it's really important to bring them into an adulthood that also involves awareness of others. And so if gift giving can become a place to discuss gratitude and to discuss the needs of others and the possibility of charitable giving to third persons as well, then that second person gift giving doesn't have to occlude the existence of third persons, but it can embrace them and can become an occasion for even better moral development. That's a suggestion. I like to think that when at holiday seasons, we also collectively think about how we benefit those who are more distant from us and begin to build that broader moral landscape and not just that narrow moral landscape. You have to balance that, right? You need those second persons that make us who we are relationships that make us who we are have to be cultivated, but I don't think they have to be cultivated to the exclusion of a concern with third person relationships. Does that help a little bit? I hope it does.
There's also a family of questions. Is my sound okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. There's also a family of questions kind of getting at objective knowledge, like mathematics or making sure that there's a basis for arguing against alternative facts, or political libel, like when Michael Dukakis was said to be soft on crime.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a concern that some people have about, well, where does objective science or objectivity come in?
That's a very good question. It's actually funny because I just did a weird podcast. I even forget who it was for, that was kind of about this. But I forget who I was doing this with. Anyway, this is how it goes sometimes. But they wanted to know about about logic and sort of, doesn't logic stand on its own 2 feet? And I had to explain that no, it doesn't. There's a wonderful metaphor that my great hero Chandrakirti uses for thinking about the way that knowledge is structured. So a lot of people think, I think that this is just a mistake, to think that knowledge is based on foundations, that maybe our sensations or our sense perceptions give us knowledge and everything's built up on that, or that our mathematical knowledge is built up on absolutely certain axioms that we can verify, and that everything else is built up on that. And that we somehow have to first get those foundations right and then build everything up from there. And this, I'm not making this up, right? If you read Descartes' Meditations, which is a book I think everybody should read at some point in their lives, Descartes begins, the very beginning of the meditation says, I've thought for some time that I need to build a secure foundation for the sciences. And Descartes' approach was to find those foundations. So Chandrakirti had a very different view. Chandrakirti, in talking about the relationship between the means we have for getting knowledge, that is our senses and our reasoning and the testimony of others and all of that, and the objects of knowledge, he said it's like stacks of sheaves of grain leaning up against each other. So if you, and you know, this, it's a traditional Indian metaphor. So if you're harvesting wheat, you bind it up into sheaves and then you can make stacks leaning up. You don't have one stack at the bottom that supports the others. They each support the other. And so when I think about this, I think about it kind of like this. If I look outside and I see that it's snowing, and I wonder, how do I know that it's snowing? Well, I say, well, because I can see it. But how do I know that my eyes give me knowledge? Well, that's because my ophthalmologist told me that my vision is okay. And my wife reassures me that I'm not hallucinating. She says she sees the snow too, right? So I only know that about the object of knowledge because I've got confidence in my subjective instrument. But I also only have confidence in the instrument because it gives me objects and because somebody else tells me that it's all true, right? So there's all of these different things supporting one another. That's how science works. We get confidence that our apparatus works because it delivers objects of knowledge. But we have confidence that those are objects of knowledge because we're confident in the apparatus. And we're often confident in that because somebody else told us about it. And we're confident that in their testimony because we trust where they got their degree. We trust where they got their degree because those people produce knowledge. And it's just this big mutual interdependence. That's how Chandrakirti thought we got knowledge. And I think that's absolutely right. We could see that because when we sort of actually do teaching, that's how we do it. When we justify what we do, that's how we do it. And so I think that all of this means that it's our conventions for justification. It's the instruments that we justify. It's the things that we know that all work together to generate knowledge. And if you ask, well, if we get outside, if you ask what justifies all of that, how do we stand outside the entire enterprise of knowledge to justify its utility? The answer is you don't, and you can't, and there's no place like that. There is no Archimedean fulcrum outside of the practice of investigation, justification, argument, and research that tells you that investigation, justification, and argument all work. There's a wonderful Chinese text, not a Buddhist text. Actually, we've talked about the Zhuangzi. So in the Zhuangzi, in chapter 2, Zhuangzi has a wonderful argument, and it's a little complex to develop, but his point in that argument is simply this. If you thought that the only reason that arguments work is because there's a foundation for them, then you would need an argument to show you that that foundation worked. But if you had an argument, you'd have to know that it had a foundation, and you need another argument to show you that, and you'd be off on a terrible regress. And as he says at the end, the entire world is one great argument. The entire world is just one great point to be made. And his point is, again, you never get to stand outside of reason to justify it. You never get to stand outside of science to justify it. You never get to stand outside of mathematics to justify it. Mathematics is justified by doing mathematics. Science is justified by doing science. Inference is justified by inferences. And there's no Archimedean point. That might sound terrifying, that there are no foundations. But one of the deepest insights in Buddhist philosophy says in the 8,000 line Perfection of Wisdom Sutra that you have to learn. Bodhisattvas are comfortable with the idea that there are no foundations. Really, really important. That's like Hakuin saying the great death is like leaping off a cliff, though he probably didn't say it. You never got hurt by leaping, only if you hit the bottom. If there's no bottom, there's no worry. I think that's really important to see. It might seem like our life would be better if we had foundations, but then you'd have to recognize you'd have no reason to believe in them. That would be weird. We're at 9 o'clock. Do you want me to keep going or do you want to stop? Up to you, William.
Well, I'm seeing some people requesting keeping on going.
Okay.
Raise your hand if you want a few more minutes of questions.
Okay, there's a few hands.
Keep holding your hands up as I go through the.
People who don't want them can always just say goodnight, I guess, right? There's no reason why.
Yeah, a lot of people want to keep going.
Okay.
Most people, it looks like. So maybe I should take this opportunity for those of you who are ready to take off. Just thanks so much for joining us.
And I second that. Thank you very, very much. And there's no obligation to hang around. Consider this a just informal discussion afterwards.
Okay, this is like going to a coffee shop or a bar after the lecture.
Yeah.
And some people go home from the lecture and they have obligations that need to be taken care of. And now we're just going to pull up our chairs again around the table. And it's a little loud, and everybody's talking at once. There are a lot of great questions. Yeah. Okay, so here's another family of questions, Jay, that have kind of come in from the beginning of tonight and all the way through, and some kind of from previous weeks also.
That's fine.
And it's sometimes it's framed as, well, is there a way to reconcile Madhyamaka kind of deconstruction of the self and the Yogacara stronger sense of the self? Sometimes it's articulated as, is Buddha nature really just another word for soul or self? How does Buddha nature come into this? What might it mean to say that we're already enlightened or we have a Buddha nature? Kind of, you get the kind of family of questions that.
Okay.
being
I'm going to
articulated there.
take the prerogative of cutting that question in half and answering half of it, but not the other half. So I'm going to answer the Yogacara Madhyamaka question, but I'm not going to answer the Buddha nature question. And I'm not going to answer it because it would just take, I don't see a way to do it in less than hours, because it takes us into a long set of byways. But I can talk about the Yogacara Madhyamaka issue fairly concisely. And I'm going to do that by thinking about the complementary role of Yogacara and Madhyamaka philosophy. And think about that in two ways. One is by thinking about the nature of emptiness from each perspective. And secondly, by thinking about the difference between analysis from the side of the object and analysis from the side of the subject. So, first things first. As I said way near the beginning, when we say that something is empty, this was the point of Chandrakirti's snake, we always have to ask empty of what? And in the Madhyamaka tradition, that is always glossed as emptiness of intrinsic identity or emptiness of intrinsic reality. And we've seen that to think of a person as opposed to a self is to think of ourselves as interdependent rather than intrinsically existent. That makes total sense. I've been operating in this entire 4 lectures from a Madhyamaka perspective. If you're interested in hearing me operate from a Yogacara perspective, go to the Shravasti Abbey site, and I gave them a many day course on Yogacara, and you can hear what I say about that at length. But briefly, when we ask the question from the Yogacara perspective, what is it? What is something empty of? The emptiness there is the emptiness of subject-object duality. And that's different from emptiness of intrinsic nature, but it's not unrelated to it. It's a very specific gloss on that. So we're saying that when I see an object, like my hand or like beautiful pot in my hand. It's nice to have a pot when you're doing Indian philosophy. When I say the pot is empty of subject-object duality, I mean that even though my naive experience of the pot is that there's me, the subject, confronting the pot as object, if I really pay attention to the nature of that entire event, that duality is an imposition, not a reality. In the same way that, say, in the Mueller-Lyer illusion that we've used, the difference in the lengths of the lines is a superimposition, not part of the reality. Now we can connect this to the difference between analysis from the side of the subject and analysis from the side of the object. His Holiness the Dalai Lama, in a wonderful teaching that he gave in New Delhi about a decade ago, that actually has a very long and interesting history of Tibetan philosophy, talked about Madhyamaka as providing an analysis of emptiness from the side of the object, and Yogacara as providing an analysis of emptiness from the side of the subject. And I think that's dead right. So, Madhyamaka analysis, we take objects of knowledge like pots or people, and we explain why they exist only conventionally, not intrinsically, but that we superimpose intrinsic reality on them as a kind of illusion, as something that the distinction between their mode of being and their mode of appearance is that their mode of being is as conventional interdependent phenomena, but the mode of appearance is an intrinsically identifiable phenomena. Okay. Now, you can then ask the question, so what's the nature of that superimposition? What causes that superimposition? What leads to that superimposition? And Yogacara is answering that question about the subjective side, saying the way we do that is we take experience and we impose a subject-object duality on it. And then we treat the object as an independent thing that we simply encounter in subjectivity, as external to our minds, not as in our minds. And that's important to see, so that when I see that pot, you want to know the reality? The reality, according to psychophysics, is that light bounces off an object and it goes into my eye and it gets refracted through a bunch of jelly, turned upside down, causes electrical impulses to be generated by photoreceptors on the back of my retina, sends electronic image impulses to the back of my brain through two different streams. They get integrated back there and experience happens of a pot. Now, that's what happens. I'm not making this up. This isn't any kind of weird Buddhist mysticism. That's just reality. Does that stuff happening in my occipital cortex look like this? That's crazy, right? I mean, it'd be really bad if there was a pot embedded in my occipital cortex. I would die. Nonetheless, I don't feel like, oh, what's happening right now is a whole bunch of electronic activity in my occipital cortex. I feel like, oh, I'm directly seeing a pot, unmediated by anything. I'm in just direct contact as subject with that object. And the moment I say that now, I know that it's bullshit, right? That's the illusion of subject-object duality. That's the illusion that this thing exists intrinsically, exactly as I experience it, and that I've got detectors that detect that intrinsic reality, and whatever's happening here looks just like that, which is done. That's the Yogacara analysis. Notice those aren't inconsistent. Yogacara is giving me the subjective or psychological analysis of how it is that I come to experience a world as having intrinsic reality. And so I think there's no inconsistency between Madhyamaka and Yogacara at all. I think they're just giving us different sides of the analysis. But each of them is a no-self side. So the premise of that question I now want to come back to was, stronger sense of self in Yogacara? Absolutely not. Because what Yogacara is trying to do is to take the duality of self and object, see that as the principal illusion, and deconstruct it. If you deconstruct that, you don't just lose the object, you lose the subject. You lose that whole framework of subject-object. You lose the framework of a self registering objects in the world. And the place to see that develop beautifully, if you want to read it in a great Buddhist text, is in Treatise from Havanirdeša, the treatise on the three natures by Vasubandhu, where he makes the point that once you see that the object doesn't have any intrinsic dualistic existence, you see that the subject doesn't either. So don't ever succumb to the idea that Madhyamaka tells you have your no self, and then Yogacara tells you you've got one. Because Yogacara is attacking the self from the subjective side, as Madhyamaka is attacking it from the objective side. Give you 5 more minutes and my throat will give out.
So, Jay, we're down to about 130 something participants and people are raising their hands. For 5 more minutes, should we have people ask very, very brief questions themselves, or should Sarah and I continue to?
However you want to do it. I'm at your disposal. I'm just the answerer.
Okay, well, there's been one question that has come through a bunch of times in a version. I'll ask that one, then we can go to the hands that are up. And
Okay.
that is, what if somebody's being mean to me or attacking me? How do I take care of myself and respond in the way that
Okay.
Brahma Viharas or Shantideva might suggest?
I think it's a really good question. And for me, the best advice, I'm not saying it's easy, is Shantideva's advice in the 6th chapter. And I'm not saying this is easy, but I think it's the most rational advice. I ask myself the following question: what is causing this person to behave as he or she is behaving? What are the causes and conditions that impel that? What does that person feel like that they're acting this way? If I know that somebody is feeling so awful that they would treat me this way, should I be feeling anger or care for them? Is there a way that I can help them to stop feeling and behaving that way? And I know, by the way, that acting angrily won't do that. You can try this at home, right? Anger doesn't suddenly get people to say, oh, I'm sorry, let me be nicer to you. It just puts petrol on the fire. So how can I calm things down? Sometimes the right answer to that, now I'll go back to Chinese stuff, not Buddhist stuff, is to remember that if you want to resolve a situation like that, you don't meet anger head on. You move to the side. You let the anger go this way and you step aside. And that requires not reacting. that requires taking that long, deep breath and saying, well, her calling me all of these names and accusing me of these things actually doesn't have to harm me unless I react to it emotionally. Let me think more about why they're doing that and about what I could do to get them to stop behaving that way. You might succeed and you might not, but I promise you that it will work better than meeting anger with anger. I've actually never seen a circumstance where somehow anger made things better. I think that's something to remember. If your goal is to make things better, anger is a really dumb way to do that. And when you do that, I think you can develop more self-respect. You can begin to say, wow, I'm somebody who can control my moral emotions and can turn a bad situation into something good. And that's much better than being somebody who's in thrall and captivated by a negative situation and can't do anything about it. So I think that's pretty cool if you can do it. Try it. It's better than shouting.
Okay, Jay, I think we need to give your voice a
Okay.
rest.
Thank you all very, very much. I've enjoyed this immensely, and I'm very grateful for your questions and your participation and your interest and all of that stuff. And I hope that I see many of you again, maybe someday in person after we have our vaccinations. There is hope. Remember, today is the darkest day of the year. Tomorrow, there will be more sunshine than there was today, and that will keep happening for quite a while. Keep that thought.
And maybe Sarah, Jay, and I will stay on. And I hope everybody who can gets a chance to go out and see Jupiter and Saturn closer from our
Around here,
view.
it's too cloudy.
Yeah, but closer if you can than they've been in 800 years.
Yeah.
It's auspicious.
Bye, everybody.
Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.
Right.
Mm. Mm. Ooh.
Oh, and if you're still online and you're listening, the slides are uploaded to the website, and we will be sending out an email with the Donna link and a survey and a reminder of where to get the slides.
You want to stop the recording now?
Yes, let's stop the recording.